and welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast. I'm your host, Rafael Nadal. I'm joined today by my good friend, Nelfo Mulla. Today's topic is about the U.S. Open. So we're going to talk about it a little bit more from a historical perspective. We're recording this on Friday, September 6th, so right before the women's semifinals kick off in the singles and a couple days before the men's final. So we originally planned to discuss this a couple weeks ago, but due to some scheduling conflicts, we had to shift things around. But as you mentioned before we hit record, it's been kind of nice, the fact that we were able to record this a little bit later because we have a more clear picture of what might happen here coming up in the final, of course, on the men's and women's side. But before we jump into current events, I want to talk about some of the historical aspects of the tournament and its status as a tennis major. So I think the general perception is that, of the four majors, the US Open is probably a distant second to Wimbledon in terms of prestige. Why is that? And we'll start with, why do you think that is?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on. Always a pleasure to talk to you and discuss tennis, which will be the next 30 to 45 minutes. I think for me personally, tennis essentially started in England, right? So you have to understand the U.S., we're going to be celebrating our 250th anniversary in 2026. So we're still a relatively young country, right? England, basically 1880s was when sort of the first Wimbledon happened, right? So they sort of had a head start. The U.S. was recovering, of course, from Civil War. Sports were just starting to get in. Obviously, English, we call it soccer. They've been playing football forever. So I think the history and the prestige of Wimbledon is because it's the oldest tennis tournament in the world. They're very big on their traditions, all things traditions in England. So I think it's maintained that, but I actually will say I do feel the gap is closing. And the reason I say that is Arthur Ashe Stadium, where all the big matches are played. That is the largest tennis court in the world. So that sort of helps as well. I think because it's sort of the last major of the year, it's the one that everybody wants to win because you essentially hit the end of the year on a high note, heading into the Australian Open, which is always the first major of the year. In January, and Wimbledon sort of really stuck in that middle, right? Wimbledon is stuck in the middle, and we saw in the pandemic it was the only tournament to be canceled because literally it's in the middle of the year. They were not able to move it around because the tennis calendar is pretty much in set in stone. So yeah, yes, while Wimbledon is still probably the most prestigious, I actually wouldn't be surprised if maybe in our lifetime even the U.S. Open supersedes it. It's still not there yet; still has a ways to go. But I think you have, the big name players wanting to play here a lot. Obviously New York as a city, at least in my opinion, right, is much cooler, if you'll say, or prestigious than London. People will disagree with me on there, but for sure, between the U.S. Open and Wimbledon, those are the two biggest majors. With all due respect to the Australian Open and the French Open, also known as Roland Garros. So I think for sure in the northern and southern South America by far. It's the most prestigious tournament, and yeah, probably still number two to Wimbledon, but that gap is closing.
I would agree. New York is probably a cooler city. Maybe it takes a hit because it's in Queens and it's in kind of a sleepy
Absolutely.
part of Queens. So
Absolutely.
you're kind of in the suburbs, kind of a little bit, I'd say.
You are. You
Um,
are.
I yeah, I know you've been to the U.S. Open. I have as well. It was a long time ago, maybe about 10 years ago. Got a chance to see Andy Murray, got a chance to see some of the big name players. What I really liked about it was I went in the early stages, so there was just tennis matches everywhere you look. There was at Arthur Ashe, there was at the other stadium. The name
Louis
escapes me at this. Yeah, there you go, Louis Armstrong, and then there's a bunch of like matches on really small courts. It almost felt like I was, back in high school watching my friends play tennis because it's like three, four bleachers, but these are professional tennis players. So everywhere you look, there's like a almost like a festival atmosphere at the U.S. Open where people are just hanging out. They're drinking their I don't know if it's the mint juleps, but I think there's a signature drink as well with the U.S. Open. But
The
people are just
Honeydews.
hanging out. There you go. And it's at the end of the summer in New York, and New York summers are amazing. And it's at that point where it's a little less humid and there's a little bit of chill in the air, which is always nice. Little break from the summer. But I want to talk about some of the traditions at Wimbledon compared to the U.S. Open. So one thing is the difference in the court. So the U.S. Open is just like you would expect, a hard concrete, whatever surface, but Wimbledon is still grass. Is that the only tournament that has grass still?
The only major tournament,
The
yeah.
only
So what
major,
they
yeah.
call is grass season, which essentially is right around that June, July timeframe. It's actually the shortest season if you think about it, because both the Australian Open and the US Open are hard courts. So essentially, for starting right away in January, right when the Australian Open starts, that's hard courts. February's hard courts as well. March is hard courts. The U.S. has two big tournaments in March: Indian Wells in California, and then Miami. That pretty much takes up the entire month of March and half of April. Those are hard courts. And then you have clay court season, which really is sort of May, April and May with the French Open, of course. So yeah, so with Wimbledon, it's only that. I think the other big thing is Wimbledon is very much, obsessively rigid when it comes to tradition. So at Wimbledon, everybody wears all white. That's been a rule from the beginning, and that's probably never going to change. The U.S., you kind of have the more kind of flamboyant, outrageous colors. People dress up how they want. A famous match 10, 15 years ago, Roger Federer versus Andy Murray. Roger Federer in the all black night atmosphere. People still talk about that, right? He, of course, made his return as a spectator this tournament,
Do
which
you
we'll get into
remember?
later on in the call.
Sorry to
But
cut you off,
yeah, I think that's
but
the
you
thing is with
remember?
Wimbledon, everybody's wearing it.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but do you remember Serena's black cat outfit that everyone
Absolutely.
made? Was that at the U.S. Open?
It was at the US Open, and they were talking more about that than her play on the field. So in a way, it was a little distracting. But at the end of the day, she backed it up because she won the tournament that year. So yeah, those are the stuff people will be talking about. You don't get that much discussion about what they're wearing because everybody's in all white, right? So it's almost like a school uniform, if you will. Obviously, they can change it up a little bit, but that is the one tradition that's how you're going to change. And then, of course, the food atmosphere, right? The strawberries and cream, big tradition at Wimbledon. U.S. Open has, the mint julep, the honey deuce, different types of food. You got, pretty much anything you want, you can get there. Pizza, burgers, chicken wings. Whereas I think Wimbledon is a lot more limited in the options as well. But both great tournaments to watch. One of my bucket list items is to actually watch Wimbledon in person. Have not had a chance to get there yet.
The phrase I use for Wimbledon is pomp and circumstance.
Well
It
said.
it feels a little bit more formal. Like you said, everyone's wearing all white. The Queen is there, or the British royalty
Sure.
is there, so there's a little more, yeah, pomp and circumstance is the best way I can
Well
think
said.
of to
Well said.
describe it. Because it doesn't feel like a festival the way the U.S. Open is. It's like a festival of tennis. Like
Right.
Wimbledon is like a royal ball of tennis. So it's
Yeah.
a little bit of a different feel to it. Uh, in terms of the American success at the U.S. Open. That's been a hot topic. That's something that we
Sure.
definitely wanted to discuss. And again, like I said at the Open 2 weeks ago, we're probably having a different discussion
Right.
about, let's talk about the past more. But I definitely do want to talk about the past. But this year, there's a possibility that we will see an American winner on the women's side, which isn't. I mean, that happened last year, so it's not a big deal.
It's it.
But there's guarantee of at least one American in the final. We'll see if they're able to win. But over the years, over the decades, who on the men's side, from an American perspective, was the most dominant player, and then of course on the women's side as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I'll answer that in two parts. I think it's easy on the women's side, right, to look at Serena Williams, right? She was a five-time winner of the U.S. Open, 23-time major winner, right? Dominated for basically 2 decades. I still remember her first slam win was at the U.S. Open. In fact, it was exactly 25 years ago this week, 1999. I was a freshman in college, and essentially at that point she was overshadowed by her sister, from watching King Richard, right? Will Smith winning the Oscar there. Venus was really the one that everybody thought would be the bigger player. She was the one who kept getting the training. She was older, she was more mature, had that more power. And Venus actually got to the US Open final in 1997. She lost to Martina Hingis, but Serena actually beat Martina Hingis in 1999 after Martina Hingis beat her sister Venus in the semifinal. So it was a little bit of a family, revenge, avenging tour. But yeah, as soon as Serena, that did wonders for her game, because as soon as she won that first major, the next 20-ish years were dominated by her. So she ended up, again, like I said, with 23. Venus only ended up with 7, which is still one of the all-time greats. But the two sisters together alone count for 30 singles titles, and that's not even counting all the doubles titles that they won together playing as well. I distinctly remember 2002, 2003 time, all 4 majors, 4 in a row, featured Venus versus Serena in the final. Serena won all 4 of those matches to call it the Serena Slam. Granted, it wasn't in the same calendar year, so they didn't count it as a Grand Slam, but by my definition, that counts because she won 4 in a row, and she beat her sister in the final of every tournament. So you got to start with them, right? I think if you go farther back, though, into the 70s and 80s, Billie Jean King, which is what the National Tennis Center is named after, the Billie Jean King National Tennis Center, which is where they play the U.S. Open, she was a pioneer, right, fighting for women's rights, women's equal pay, which Venus then continued as well. And it took 50 years to get there. Venus finally got it done a few years ago. But, they call them the original 9. These are 9 women who essentially said that, we want to have our own tour. And they got that tour, which is the modern WTA tour. I think on the women's side as well, Chris Evert, Martina Navratilova, who was originally from Czechoslovakia, but then became a U.S. citizen. The two of them dominated, right? One of the trivia questions I always get when I go for tennis trivia is, what's the greatest rivalry in terms of number of matches? So all the newbies always say, oh, Federer Nadal, right? Or Federer Djokovic, or Nadal Djokovic. And to be fair, those are pretty big numbers. I think it's 40, 50, and 60 respectively among the three of them versus each other. But Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova played 80 times.
Wow.
So 80 times, by far and away the greatest rivalry just from a numbers basis we've ever seen. And both of those were Americans. And then I think on the men's side, any discussion of all-time greats, especially, if you're limiting to just Americans, it's got to start with, Pete Sampras, right? Prior to Roger Federer, he was the all-time major leader with 14 majors, 7 Wimbledons, 5 U.S. Opens, never won the French Open, which definitely now I think sort of does come into play because Andre Agassi on the other side, while he has less majors total, he did win the French Open. He won all 4 of them. So there's that interesting debate. Those two played. I still remember the first U.S. Open I ever attended as a kid was that final. I was 8 years old. It was Sampras versus Agassi, both teenagers in the final. And I was hooked ever since that match. Sampras demolished Agassi straight sets. I think it was like 2-3-1 or something. Very, very big deal. But they had that great rivalry. And then going prior to that, I think you got to think about guys like John McEnroe, right? Probably one of the most well-known, right, tennis players with his attitude, kind of just, don't care about anything. Jimmy Connors. And then to be honest, you got to start with Arthur Ashe, right? The biggest stadium in the world named after Arthur Ashe, who unfortunately passed away from AIDS, right, in the early 90s. But the first black man to win the U.S. Open, probably one of the all-time great American players. So it's a big history and a big tradition. But I think that's the point is we're looking for that next winner, right? Andy Roddick, 2003, so 21 years ago, won the U.S. Open, his only major. He got to several finals, but always ran into Federer or Nadal sometimes even, always ran into those guys. But he does have the distinction right now of being the last male American winner of a singles tournament, and it happened to be at the U.S. Open. So we're looking for that next one. And, big match tonight, Frances Tiafoe, Taylor Fritz, right? Who at the beginning of the tournament, if you ask me, I would not have picked either one of them to win it all. I probably would have tipped my hat to either Alcaraz or Djokovic. Both of those guys were knocked out pretty early, which is what makes this tournament so great, is you have a lot more upset at this tournament, I feel, than at other tournaments. So yeah, the winner of that will play the winner of Yannick Sinner and who's Italian, and a British player named Jack Draper. So I think Sinner is the number 1 seed, so he's probably the favorite, but anything can happen. That home crowd, I feel, of the U.S. Open really is a big deal. We've seen it time and time again where an American woman on that side gets to the final. Last year with Coco Gauff, this year Jessica Pegula is going to play tomorrow. That crowd really rallies around their Americans, and that might be enough to make the difference. But we'll see tonight. It's going to be a big one. I'll be watching.
Yeah, you mentioned upsets. So, I mean, before the tournament, I was looking at the top 5 favorites on both the men's and women's side. So 4 of the 5 favorites on the men's side were already eliminated. Sinner had the 3rd best odds. And on the women's side, Pegula was not in the top 5. I'll say that. So she has a chance to win it all, and she wasn't in the top 5. Maybe she was in the top 10. I didn't look that far down the list. But what is it about the U.S. Open that leads to more upsets? Is it because it's at the end of the year, different? I know it's not a different type of surface than most tournaments, but what is it about it?
That's a great point. I think first and foremost, it is the end of the year. So the tennis season is grueling, right? There's not just the 4 majors. There's tournaments every week. And the rules have actually changed. If you want to maintain your ranking, you have to play a certain number of tournaments a year, unless you're injured, of course. You can get a medical exemption if you're injured. But, you can't just come in and play the 4 majors, right? So you have to play at least, I think the number is between 10 and 15 tournaments a year. And at some of these shorter tournaments, you're playing every day. The benefit of the U.S. Open is you generally have a rest day in between each of your matches. But for some of these shorter tournaments, I mean, you're playing on a Tuesday, you're playing on a Wednesday, you're playing on a Thursday, and the farther you go, the more you play. I also feel, just like other athletics, people that play tennis now are that much more physically athletic, physically strong. So it's taking a lot more out of you to win. If you want to be in the top 100, right, in the world, it's taxing on your body. So I do think the U.S. Open, we had several people this year pull out last minute, right? Ons Jabeur, one of my favorite players, from Tunisia, a crowd favorite too, called the Minister of Happiness. She pulled out with an injury. Elena Rybakina, a Grand Slam champion a couple of years ago at Wimbledon, she pulled out. Both of these are top 10 players. And then even on the men's side, right, people getting hurt. I think it's because of the fact that it is the end of the year. And I also think, the travel, does make a difference, right? A lot of these players are coming from overseas, right? Traveling into New York, getting adjusted, different continent, different time zone. And then of course, to be fair, people are, unless you're like Novak Djokovic, who's insanely, focused and just comes for the tennis. If people are going to be in New York, there's a lot of distractions, right? You're going to be out kind of looking at the scenes, getting food. So you don't just come to New York to play tennis unless, in my opinion, you're Novak Djokovic, right? Which is an exception. We can have a podcast just about him some other time. But a lot of these players, they come in, they see it. For some of them, this is maybe their first or second time in New York. They don't live here, right? They live elsewhere. So I think all those things together, and then just the fact that, to me, I really feel the crowd makes a difference, right? So a lot of times these upsets of higher seeds are by crowd favorites, and they don't always have to be American. Sometimes the crowd just latches on. Paula Badosa, she's Spanish, right? But she was born and raised in New York City. She's a crowd favorite. So usually, even if she's seated lower, the crowd just gets to her. And then the flip side, the crowd, I mean, this is New York, right? Not the nicest people in the world. So when they don't like you, they will make it known. Novak Djokovic took 20 years for the crowd to finally like him. People used to just not like him. I don't want to use the word hate. I think that's too strong, but they would boo him early in his career. It took a while. Federer had a little bit of an issue his first year. I mean, he was lovable by everybody, but eventually he got them one over in a year. It took Djokovic 2 decades. But I think the crowd is something that we just, that atmosphere, like, in your face, really makes a difference. So I think it's a combination of all that. But it's super exciting. I mean, there's always an upset every year. It's very rare that both number one seeds win. And I don't think I've ever remember a time where it's been the number one and the number 2 seed on both sides. There's always some sort of an upset that happens. Whereas in the other tournaments, you have a lot more chalk, as you call it, in the bracket system.
That makes a lot of sense. I didn't think about a home field advantage, so to speak, or home court advantage when it came to tennis. It's just, I mean, because I get it. People cheer. They're not cheering during the action, but there is a lot of cheering, between the sets and after each point. So I can see why somebody that's a little lower ranked could get lifted up by the energy of the crowd. So you mentioned Djokovic and Federer. They are the kind of unquestioned GOATs, along with another player that potentially played his last tournament at the U.S. Open in Rafael Nadal. What's his legacy? Where is he on that GOAT pyramid? And I think the final question is stylistically, how is he different? Because I feel like he was always a little different than the other two. What was different about his game? And this is going to lead to another question I have about surfaces and stuff. But let's start with Nadal first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, no question about it, right? Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, the three of them. Any conversation of the GOAT has to start with the three of them, right? Growing up, Pete Sampras was my guy always. And even when Federer overtook him from 14 to 15, I still made the argument that, yeah, but Sampras played at a tougher time, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, once these guys all got to 20 majors, and now Djokovic is at 24, Nadal's at 22, Federer ended up at 20. I mean, that discussion of anybody else was blown out of the water. It's essentially the Tom Brady 7 Super Bowls versus Joe Montana 4, right? The gap is that wide. So until someone comes around, which, we'll get into later with Alcaraz, maybe another podcast, right now it's the three of them. But specifically to answer your question, with Nadal was the undisputed GOAT of clay. He won the French Open, also known as Roland Garros, 14 times. That is the most anyone has won any tournament, not just a major. I mean, you're talking, Frisco Open or Dallas Open or whatever you want to call it. Any tournament, small tournament to big tournament, was never won by any player 14 times. Nadal won the French Open, which is the most prestigious clay court tournament in the world, 14 times. So any discussion with Nadal has to start with that. And I think the reason he was so good on that surface is the surface is slower on clay. The ball does not come as fast as it does on hard court or especially on grass. And Nadal was the best defensive player you've ever seen, right? He molded his game based on some of the greats of the past, like Bjorn Borg, Andre Agassi, some of these tennis greats on clay. So no matter what you gave to him, he would always get it back to you. That's how he won all his tournaments, is by grinding you and just beating you at your own game. You could not get anything by him. And then, of course, he developed a strong serve. He developed a strong, forehand, but it was always his backhand return, always getting it back. Looking back, though, that also ended up causing a lot of his injuries. The way he would hit the ball with such torque, he ended up having many, many surgeries and injuries throughout his career. And that's probably why, we may have seen him play his last match, right? He's right at Djokovic's age. So he's definitely younger than Federer was. Federer played until he was right at 40 before he had to call it quits. With Nadal, he's only 36 or 37, which in old days was ancient, but in today's day and age, it's average, right? People are getting older and playing tennis longer. But I think the toll that kind of style took on his body was just, you weren't able to do that. Whereas with Federer and Djokovic, for them, it's like, the offense, right? The serve, get it in, the forehand, right? Federer on grass, nothing like it, right? The serve and the volley, which we don't see anymore, right? Again, adopted from Pete Sampras. So what these guys did is they looked at the greats of the past, molded their game on that, and just took it to the next level, right? With athleticism, right? Kind of that mental focus, which was never talked about maybe 5, 10, even 15 years ago, which is all the thing now, is that mental game, right? At the end of the day, it's hitting a tennis ball. So what makes one player better than the other? It's that mental fortitude when you're facing a clutch point or a pressure point. One of my favorite stats of Roger Federer, which he even mentioned in his speech recently, was he won like 75 to 80% of his matches, but he only won 52% of his points. I mean, it's literally that close. Every match you take, it's within 5 or 6%, and it's those clutch points that you win, which 100% relates back to your mental game. So Nadal had that mental game, Djokovic had the mental game, Federer had the mental game, so much to the point that they were beating people 10, 15 years younger than them all the way until their body just couldn't take it anymore. But yeah, any discussion will start with them. My personal favorite would always be Federer, right? Summer of 1981, got to tip my hat to him. But I think at this point, even though I love Federer, I mean, there's no question that Novak Djokovic is the GOAT, statistically speaking. He's won the most. He's won the most tournaments. He has the most impressive resume. He's been number one the most weeks in all time. So even though I'm not a Djokovic fan, I have to tip my hat and respect him. And yeah, he is the unquestioned GOAT. But the other two will always be in the discussion.
Sounds like me and Tom Brady. I'm just never a fan growing up. At this point, I think I stopped hating when he moved to Tampa Bay. And it sounds like Djokovic, I mean, he's always seemed like more of the villain character than the other two guys who
Absolutely
always seemed, I mean, Federer seemed like he always had a smile on his face. With Nadal, there was always kind of a thoughtfulness to him. I felt like every time I saw him, or heard him speak, things like that, he always seemed like a more thoughtful person than Djokovic, who I guess he's taken some controversial stands recently as well with COVID vaccinations and things like that. I'm sure that hasn't helped his standing with a lot of fans. But you touched on this a little bit with clay and the surface and it being a little bit slower. What difference, like what actual difference does it have on the game, and what type of strategy do you have to bring to a game when you're playing on a hard surface versus grass versus clay? Maybe just like a quick summary on that.
Sure, absolutely. So I think we'll start with grass. And grass, it's the fastest. So the ball just moves much faster. And that's why, the serve is so important. You can literally win matches on grass with just your serve. Probably can't do that on clay or even a hard court because, if you go up against a really good player, even the fastest serve can be slow return. But the reason Pete Sampras won all those Wimbledons, the reason he won 7 Wimbledons, a 3-peat, then a 4-peat, is because he had the best serve at that time, right, compared to his competition. And I think Federer picked up on that. The other thing you can do is with grass, you can serve it, and even if your opponent gets it back, you're up there to volley it, right? So you serve a great fast one, they return it back, it's up in the air, boom, you slam it. With clay, it's the exact opposite. You can still serve pretty quickly, but the ball moves much slower. With the clay, it's absorbing it, so the bounce isn't as high, right? So with the clay court, it's all about kind of returning the shot, getting it back to a point where your opponent cannot get it. So you'll see a lot more drop shots, a lot shallower shots, having your opponent come to the net, and then once it's in the net, just either lob it behind them, they'll have a tough time running back, or just slam it in their face. It's more favors, in my opinion, better returners, right? Better defensive players getting that shot back. And Nadal was the king of that, right? He just understood how to play that. He had that torque, he had that spin. The spin is also different coming up from clay versus grass or hard court. And then hard court, I would say, is probably in between both of them. You know, it doesn't move as fast as grass, doesn't move as slow as clay. So you sort of have to adjust. You can basically serve somebody off the court on hard court, which is what Andy Roddick did, right? In 2003, when he won that, he was the fastest server in the world. But you can also adjust your game, which is, I think, what Djokovic did when he won it. In fact, he won it last year. Djokovic then kind of took the best of both worlds of that offense and defense and just made it into one. And as people call him, you know, they literally call him a machine, right? He's never out of any point. He's always fighting for it. And at the end of the day, it's the clutch points that he wins. As good as Federer was, he was also notorious for blowing match points. You know, if you look at it over his career, Federer probably blew maybe 20 to 30 matches, some very important ones. You know, even in 2019 against Djokovic at Wimbledon, he had 2 championship points, blew them both. I think with Djokovic, you can literally probably count on your finger the number of times he's lost a match after having match point. When he gets to that last game, he just gets to another level mentally that you can't compete with. And I think that's really what's distinguished him is he wins the key points more importantly. Nadal was like that on clay. So Nadal would always dominate Djokovic on clay. The only times he lost to him was when he was getting to that age where he just physically couldn't compete anymore. And Djokovic took advantage of that, as anybody would, right? He found a weakness in Nadal's game physically, and he just exploited that. But it's very nuanced, right? In the U.S., predominantly hard court, right? In Europe, you've got a mixture of clay and grass. And then I think in Asia as well, you know, you've got some clay and some grass. But one surface they don't play on anymore, or they play rarely on, which they used to play in the 70s, is indoor carpet. That just doesn't exist anymore. But I didn't really, you know, learn about that surface until recently. It's like, wow, some of these major tournaments were on indoor carpet. It was an indoor stadium and they played on carpet. But we're probably not going to see that anytime soon, a comeback.
Why is that?
I think it's just because people like the outdoor atmosphere. I really think it's outdoor, is, you know, more people can fit. It's become commercialized, right? More tickets, more people. If it's an indoor kind of cram session, you're not going to be able to kind of get the sponsorship of these tournaments. You know, we're excited, you know, tip to Dallas next year, the Dallas Open. It's going to be an ATP event, a 500 level, which is the second most prestigious after the 1,000. So that's going to be an outdoor event. But they do now have some training facilities indoors. But even in those indoor ones, it's hard court. So I think carpet was a thing of the past, and we're not going to see it come back anytime soon.
It's like the artificial turf they used to play on in football, where the guys were playing football in basketball shoes and cross trainers and things like that. Basically concrete with a layer of carpet laid on top. So initially we were going to talk about, because this was going to be a preview of the U.S. Open, we're going to talk about the favorites and the chances that the Americans had. So obviously we're at a different point here. We're, again, recording this on September 6th, so we have an idea. We know who's going to be in the women's final, and we have an idea that at least one American is going to make the men's final. Let's start with the women. Let's start with Jessica Pegula. What was her journey in this tournament from, you know, start to the finals here?
Yeah, so fun fact, I know we're big football fans as well. NFL season started yesterday. What a game to kick off the season. Excited about tonight in Brazil. Jessica Pegula is the daughter of the owner of the Buffalo Bills. So the Pegula family owns the Buffalo Bills. So she has been playing tennis her whole life. She's a huge Bills fan, right? So I still remember a funny story about her. Maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago. She was at the Australian Open, which happens in January. The Bills were hosting a playoff game, which of course was in Buffalo, totally different continent time zone. But she stayed up and watched it. And the saddest part is she lost her match that day, and the Bills lost to the Bengals at home. So it was a doubly, you know, kind of tough day for her. But that being said, she actually has never made it this far in any major. She's never gotten this far. She's made a couple of semifinals, several quarterfinals, but she's never made the final of a major. So she's super excited to be here. I think, you know, she beat the number 1 player in the quarterfinals, Iga Swiatek, who is a 5-time major champion, who has won this tournament from Poland 2 years ago as well. So she beat her in the quarterfinals. And in the semifinals, just won a couple of days ago. She is going up against, I think, a better player, Aryna Sabalenka. She's an Australian Open winner from last year. She's ranked number 2 in the world, so she's definitely right there. Her and Swiatek usually trade places. Sabalenka has been number 1 before. So I think Sabalenka is the favorite, but that was like last year. Sabalenka was also in the final as the number 2 seed against Coco Gauff, and a lot of people didn't give Coco Gauff a chance. Sabalenka dominated her the first set. I think it was 6-2, if I recall correctly. Then the crowd really got into it to support Coco, and Coco ended up winning the next 2 sets to win the championship. I can see that happening. Even in the semifinal, she played an unranked player, Karolina Mukova. Pegula did this. She lost the first set 6-1. So people were like, "Oh my goodness, this is over. She's going to get walked off the court." Crowd came in, and then she won the next 2 sets. So I really do think if she can at least remain competitive in that first set and not get blown out, then she has a chance in those next 2 sets. It's going to be tough, though. I'll be honest. If I had to pick, I would say advantage Sabalenka, but I think the crowd gives Pegula a fighting chance. And if she wins, that will be 2 years in a row that a different American has won. The big fear was after Serena and Venus retired. Venus technically still not retired, but she can't play, the game like she used to. I mean, she's 44 years old, right? And she's still playing. She's played this sport for 30 years. We're talking about Tom Brady's 23-year career. Venus has played 30 years, which is incredible. We were worried about who's going to be the next great American after the Williams sisters, and I think we found our answer, right? You've got people like Coco Gauff, you've got people like Jessica Pegula, Emma Navarro made it to the semifinals as well. She lost to Sabalenka, but we have a great women's game, and we hope the men can continue it as well.
On the men's side, again, we don't know who's going to be in the final, but the two Americans are playing each other in one of the semis, and you mentioned them, Taylor Fritz and Frances Tiafoe. So we are guaranteed at least one in the final. What's their journey been from the start of the tournament to the semis?
Sure. So again, both players are ranked, right? Fritz is 12, Tiafoe is 20. Tiafoe at one point was a top 10 player. He made the semis 2 years ago of the U.S. Open and lost in 5 sets to Carlos Alcaraz. So that was a great match. That was the year Alcaraz won the whole thing. Taylor Fritz has made several quarterfinals. He's made 1 or 2 semifinals. But if he can win tonight, getting to that final, neither Fritz nor Tiafoe has ever made it to a Grand Slam final. So this would be a first. So I think it's going to be an epic match. I do see it going the distance. They're very well matched up. I do see it going 5 sets. My fear as a fan of American tennis is it's going to take so much out of them. And then there's really a pretty quick turnaround. So the semifinals are tonight, and then the final is Sunday afternoon. So it's not even a full 48 hours. I just feel like, one of the two emotionally will get there, whoever wins tonight, but it's going to be like that's the peak. But we'll see. I've been proven wrong before. The flip side is they're going to play the winner of Jannik Sinner and Jack Draper. I think Sinner is definitely the favorite. He has had some controversy recently. There was some illegal substance that he tested for. He was not banned. They said it was an accident, but the same thing happened to a women's player, Simona Halep, and she was banned for like 2 years. So there is definitely a little bit of mystery and controversy surrounding him. So I do think if it gets to a Sinner versus Fritz or Tiafoe final, you'll have kind of the crowd obviously cheering the American on, but also, maybe being a little bit kind of rude and hoping that they can throw Sinner off his game. But again, maybe I'm getting too soon, right? This Jack Draper character, young British guy, people are calling him the next Andy Murray potentially, right? He actually trained with Andy Murray and still texts him for advice. If he can pull off the upset, I would feel much better as an American fan if I see Draper beat Sinner. If Draper can get to the final, I would be really happy because I think both Fritz and Tiafoe can beat them. If it's going to be Sinner, I think it's going to take another effort. And again, we've seen this so many times in the past where an American would get this far and then ultimately somebody else would win it. And while it's great to have Americans getting to the semis and getting to the finals, on the women's side, they close the deal and they actually win it with Serena, with Coco Gauff, right? With Sloane Stephens 7 years ago, 2017, she won it as well, beating Madison Keys, fellow American, in the final. With the Americans, it was Andy Roddick and then nobody. So for 21 years, no American man has won a singles title. And until that happens, the drought's going to continue. So hopefully that changes this weekend, but I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, it sounds like from what you're saying, you're leaning Sabalenka, right, in the women's final, and then probably Sinner, sorry, on the men's side. So I know we don't do predictions here, but you let it slip a little bit. So you've talked about this a few times, and we talked about how Andy Roddick was the last American man to win a singles title. Why is that? What's led to this drought of great Americans? Because I think you and I are about around the same age. We did grow up in the Pete Sampras, Andre Agassi. I know you've been a tennis fan definitely longer than I have, so you've seen some of the other older greats. But we used to live in this golden age of American men's tennis champions, not just players. So what happened? Where did this gap come from?
The three players we talked about, Novak Djokovic, Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal. The three of them have won combined 66 majors. There's 4 majors a year. So think about it, 16 years, right? If they just think of it like that. Of course, they played over 20 years, but literally the year that Andy Roddick won the US Open, that was 2003. The tournament right before that was Wimbledon. Wimbledon was in July. US Open was in August, September. Federer won Wimbledon in 2003. Roddick won the US Open. They were tied at 1. Roddick stayed at 1 his whole career. Federer went to 5, 10, 15, 20. Roddick was 1 when Novak Djokovic won in 2008. 5 years later, Novak Djokovic won his first major at the Australian Open and went from 1 to 24. Those three guys just denied any, not only American, but any player, right? Literally any player. If you think about it, the entire time those three, as we colloquially call them, the big three, played, there was maybe on your hand you could count the other non-winners. So 100%, that's the answer. It's those three guys. But to be fair, they didn't win every tournament. So you had Juan Martín del Potro from Argentina, who just retired this year. He won in 2009. You had a Croatian, Marin Cilic. He won in 2014. Dominic Thiem won the US Open in 2020. So the funny thing is, as much as these big three dominated, the one tournament that they actually had some, holes in was the US Open. In Wimbledon, the three of them won like the last 20 Wimbledons. Andy Murray won a couple in there, right? The French Open, those three dominated. You had Nadal winning 14 on his own, right? Even the Australian Open, between Federer and Djokovic, they each won like 9 or something total. But the US Open was always the one that Federer won 5 in a row from 2003 to 2008, never won after that. Made it to the final a couple times, but never won. Djokovic won here and there, but the US Open is the only tournament where the three of them were not the guaranteed favorite. There was, potential to lose. And you saw that, right? You saw that happen with Alcaraz winning 2 years ago, Thiem winning the year before. Daniil Medvedev won another one, right? So those three really struggled is probably too strong of the word because they dominated. But if there ever was a little bit of a hole in their game, it was at the US Open. So, we'll see what happens. Obviously, Federer's retired a couple of years ago. Nadal's pretty much on the doorstep. Djokovic, people would have said he probably is going to retire, but he did just won the gold medal. So even though this is the first year since 2002 that none of those big three have won a major, I still put a little asterisk by it because, in an Olympic year, the Olympic medal is basically another major, and Djokovic did win that. So I'm not ready to close the door on their careers yet, but I do think next year, if you see Djokovic go the whole year and Nadal, of course, go the whole year without winning a major, I think we can officially mark the end, and hopefully that's going to be the beginning of a new renaissance of American tennis, but we'll see.
And I think that's a good point to end on. So if we are looking at a renaissance of American men's tennis, I definitely want to clarify that because on the women's side, Serena and Venus and Coco and Sloane Stephens and all these other, I guess we can kind of count Naomi Osaka. I know she's officially Japanese, but did she grow up? I think she grew up in the U.S., but she represents Japan.
But she plays for Japan. That's true, though. You're right.
Yeah. So we can kind of claim her as an American tennis player, but there's been no shortage on the women's side. So we definitely want to clarify that. But on the men's side, if you had to hitch your wagon to one horse, to one American player and say, all right, over the next 10, 15 years, this guy is, maybe not going to challenge the GOATs, but this guy's going to win a couple of these major singles titles. Who is that name?
Ooh, I kind of want to say the winner of tonight's match, but I'll probably give you a couple of them. But yeah, for sure, this is the closest chance we're going to get, right? Whoever wins tonight between Fritz and Tiafoe will be in the final of the US Open on home turf. So that's the best chance to get it done. But apart from that, you've got a guy named Sebastian Korda. He's right now not quite at his prime, but getting there. He's the son of a former player, Petr Korda, and his sister is actually Nelly Korda, the famous golfer, LPGA, multiple LPGA time winner, and I think medaled even at the Olympics recently. So you got him. You've got some other players coming up. I do think a lot of these players are still kind of in that infancy a little bit. But I think if you look at it, between Tiafoe, you got a guy named Ben Shelton, who Tiafoe beat last week. Ben Shelton, much younger than Tiafoe. I think Shelton's only 21 or 22. He plays, very brash tennis, kind of bravado. Got to the quarters last year by beating Tiafoe and then losing to Djokovic. Ben Shelton's probably a name I can think of long term. But I think at least for this tournament, yeah, if Tiafoe or Fritz can get it done, it'll end the debate of, oh, we're not waiting for another male to win the U.S. Open. And to be quite honest, yeah, I mean, I think any one of these guys, even at the collegiate level, that plays and wins a tournament and then gets to that next level, will be good. But if I had to give you one name, I do think because of his age and the fact that he's already playing at a high level, remember the name Ben Shelton. I do think we're going to hear a lot about him in the next 3 to 5 years.
All right, I'm gonna bookmark that, and I'll talk to you about it over the next couple of years, and let's track this guy's progress, see if your prediction comes through. Really appreciate you, man. You have such a deep and vast knowledge of tennis as a sport. I can tell that you're a super fan, and that really shines through on the pod. So really appreciate you, man. And let's enjoy these next couple matches because they seem like they're gonna be absolute barn burners.
Absolutely. Colin, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Enjoy the weekend.
Thanks.